Vasili Arkhipov. On October 27, 1962, a Soviet submarine called B-59 was sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, completely cut off from the surface world. The crew had been underwater for days. They had no idea whether World War III had already started above them. This was the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. American warships had located the B-59 and were dropping small signaling depth charges to force it to surface. The Soviet crew didn't know the depth charges were non-lethal signals. They thought they were under attack. Inside the submarine, the temperature had risen to over 45 degrees Celsius. Carbon dioxide levels were so high that sailors were passing out. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, had lost communication with Moscow for days and was convinced that nuclear war had begun. He decided to launch the submarine's nuclear torpedo. A Soviet submarine nuclear torpedo in 1962 had the destructive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Firing it at American warships in the middle of the Atlantic would almost certainly have triggered a full nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. On Soviet submarines of that era, launching a nuclear weapon required the agreement of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the executive officer. The captain wanted to fire. The political officer agreed. The executive officer was a man named Vasili Arkhipov. Arkhipov said no. Nobody knows exactly what was said in that submarine. The records are incomplete, and the surviving accounts differ in their details. What we know is that Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch, that there was a heated argument, and that eventually Captain Savitsky stood down and brought the submarine to the surface. The American warships allowed the B-59 to leave. The crisis eventually de-escalated. Nuclear war did not happen. Vasili Arkhipov returned to the Soviet Union, continued his naval career, and died in 1998. For decades, almost nobody outside a small circle of Cold War historians knew his name. The story of what happened on B-59 was classified by the Soviet government and only became fully public in the early 2000s. Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive, said later that Arkhipov saved the world. Not a president, not a general, not a diplomat. A 34-year-old submarine officer who kept his head when everyone around him had lost theirs, in a metal tube at the bottom of the Atlantic, with no way to know whether his decision was right until it was too late to change it. Vasili Arkhipov had 1 vote, he used it, and here we are. Irena Sendler. In 1999, a group of high school students in rural Kansas were working on a class project about the Holocaust. They came across a brief mention of a Polish woman named Irena Sendler, who was said to have saved 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II. They assumed the number was a typo. Nobody, they thought, could have saved that many people. The number was not a typo. Irena Sendler was a 29-year-old Polish social worker when the Germans occupied Warsaw in 1939. When the Nazis created the Warsaw Ghetto in 1940, sealing nearly 400,000 Jewish people behind walls in a small section of the city, Sendler obtained a permit to enter the ghetto under the pretext of conducting sanitation inspections to prevent typhus from spreading into the rest of the city. What she was actually doing was smuggling children out. Over the next 2 years, Sendler and a network of colleagues developed an elaborate system. Infants were sedated and hidden in toolboxes, potato sacks, and coffins. Older children were taught to pretend to be Catholic, given false identities, and walked out through the courthouse that straddled the ghetto wall, through underground sewers, and through a church that had entrances on both sides of the boundary. Every child who left the ghetto needed a new identity, a false name, false papers, a family to take them in. Sendler wrote each child's real name and new identity on thin slips of paper and sealed them in glass jars, which she buried under an apple tree in a neighbor's garden. Her plan was that after the war, the jars could be dug up and the children reunited with surviving family members. In October 1943, the Gestapo arrested Irena Sendler. They had been tipped off by an informant. She was taken to Pawiak prison and tortured. Her legs and feet were broken. She refused to reveal the names of her network or the location of the children. She was sentenced to death. On the morning of her scheduled execution, a Gestapo officer appeared at her cell and told her she was free to go. Zagota, the Polish underground organization she had worked with, had bribed the officer. He released her, listed her as executed in the official records, and she went back into hiding. After the war, Sendler dug up the jars from under the apple tree. Of the 2,500 children whose names were in those jars, most had survived. But most of their parents had not. The vast majority had died in Treblinka. For many of the children, the jar was the only proof of who they had once been. Irena Sendler was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. She lost to Al Gore for his work on climate change. She died in 2008 at the age of 98. When those Kansas high school students finally tracked her down, she was living in a small apartment in Warsaw. She told them she regretted only one thing, that she had not done more. Stanislav Petrov. On September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was sitting at a monitoring station outside Moscow, watching the screens that tracked American nuclear missile launches. It was 3 weeks after the Soviet military had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing 269 people, and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were at their highest point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. At 12:15 in the morning, the alarm went off. The Soviet early warning system reported that an American intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched. Then another, then 2 more. 5 missiles in total, the system said, were on their way from the United States to the Soviet Union. Petrov's job in this scenario was clear. He was supposed to report the launch up the chain of command immediately. The Soviet military doctrine of the time called for a retaliatory strike. If America launched, the Soviet Union would launch back before the incoming missiles could destroy their own launch capacity. The logic of mutually assured destruction required speed. Every minute of delay meant fewer Soviet missiles available to fire back. Petrov looked at the data. Something felt wrong. The system was reporting only 5 missiles. If the United States was actually launching a nuclear first strike, Petrov reasoned, they would not send 5 missiles. They would send hundreds, an overwhelming wave designed to destroy Soviet retaliatory capacity before it could be used. 5 missiles made no military sense as a first strike. He also knew that the early warning satellite system was relatively new and had known technical problems. The satellites detected launches by tracking the infrared signature of rocket exhaust against the background of space. There were known cases where sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had generated false readings. He had minutes to decide. If he reported a launch and he was wrong, the Soviet military response could start a nuclear war that killed hundreds of millions of people. If he didn't report and the launch was real, incoming nuclear missiles would hit the Soviet Union without any retaliatory response being prepared. Stanislav Petrov reported a system malfunction. He told his superiors the alarm was false. He was right. The system had malfunctioned. A rare alignment of sunlight and cloud cover had triggered false positives on the satellites. No missiles had been launched. The United States had not attacked. Petrov was neither punished nor rewarded. He was reprimanded quietly for improper record-keeping during the incident. He retired from the military and lived in a small apartment outside Moscow on a modest pension. He gave a few interviews in his later years and seemed genuinely puzzled by the attention. He said in one interview that he had done nothing special, that anyone in his position would have done the same thing. Historians who have studied the incident disagree. The protocols he was trained to follow said to report and let the military chain of command decide. He used his own judgment instead, in a moment when the wrong judgment would have ended civilization. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017. For most of his life, almost nobody knew what he had done. Nicholas Winton. In 1938, Nicholas Winton was a 29-year-old London stockbroker who had planned to go skiing in Switzerland for the holidays. A friend called and asked him to come to Prague instead. There was something he needed to see. What Winton saw when he arrived in Czechoslovakia was the aftermath of the Munich Agreement, the deal in which Britain and France had allowed Nazi Germany to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of peace. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees had fled into what remained of Czechoslovakia, and it was obvious to anyone paying attention that the rest of the country would fall to Germany soon as well. Winton went back to London and started making lists. Working from his kitchen table in Hampstead, he established a children's section of the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, an organization he largely invented himself. He forged documents when real ones couldn't be obtained. He pressured the British government to relax its immigration requirements for child refugees. He personally solicited British families to take in children, advertised in newspapers, and raised money to pay for the transports. Between March and August 1939, Winton organized 8 trains from Prague to London. Each train carried children, mostly Jewish, whose parents had entrusted them to a young British stockbroker they had never met, in the hope that they would survive what was coming. The children ranged in age from infants to teenagers. Many of them were put on the trains by parents who knew they would likely never see them again. Most of them were right. 669 children made it to England on Winton's 8 trains. A 9th train, scheduled to leave Prague on September 1, 1939, was cancelled when Germany invaded Poland that morning, and Britain declared war. That train was carrying 250 children. Almost all of them died in the Holocaust. Nicholas Winton came home from the war, got married, and never spoke about what he had done. He kept a scrapbook, photographs, lists of names, documents from the operation, but he put it in the attic and didn't mention it for nearly 50 years. In 1988, his wife found the scrapbook while cleaning out the attic and sent it to a Holocaust researcher. The researcher contacted the BBC. A producer tracked down some of the surviving children, now adults in their 60s, and arranged for them to appear on a television program called That's Life without telling them why. Winton was in the audience when the host held up the scrapbook and asked if anyone in the studio recognized it. He raised his hand. The host then told the audience that everyone sitting around Winton was a child he had saved. The people who stood up and surrounded him and embraced him had no idea, until that moment, who he was or what he had done for them. He was 78 years old. He had never told anyone. Nicholas Winton was knighted in 2003 and died in 2015 at the age of 106. When asked why he had kept silent for so long, he said it hadn't seemed like anything worth talking about. He had seen a problem and tried to fix it. He didn't think that was remarkable. Franz Jägerstätter. When Nazi Germany annexed Austria in March 1938, the event was met with enormous public celebration. Crowds cheered in Vienna. Austrians voted 99.7% in favor of the annexation in a subsequent referendum, a number inflated by intimidation and fraud, but also reflecting genuine enthusiasm. The Austrian Catholic Church encouraged its members to support the new order. In the small village of St. Radegund, a farmer named Franz Jägerstätter voted no. He was the only person in his village to do so. Jägerstätter was 31 years old, deeply religious, and had come to a conclusion that put him at odds with virtually everyone around him: his neighbors, his parish priest, his bishop, and eventually the military tribunal that would decide whether he lived or died. He believed that serving in Hitler's army was morally incompatible with being a Christian, and that no threat of punishment could change that. When he received his military conscription notice in 1943, he refused to report. This was not an abstract philosophical position. In Nazi Germany and its territories, refusing military service was punishable by death. His priest told him to comply. His bishop told him he had no right to set his conscience above his obligations to the state. His wife, who loved him deeply and had 3 young daughters who needed their father, begged him to reconsider. He refused. He said he could not do what he knew to be wrong simply because everyone else was doing it, and that a man who followed evil orders shared responsibility for the evil that resulted. He was arrested, tried by a military tribunal in Berlin, and sentenced to death. On August 9, 1943, the same day American bombers were striking targets across Europe, Franz Jägerstätter was executed by guillotine at Brandenburg prison. He was 36 years old. His death changed nothing immediately. The war continued for 2 more years. His village largely forgot about him. Some of his neighbors thought he had been foolish, even selfish, to leave his family for a principle. The reassessment came slowly. An American sociologist named Gordon Zahn visited St. Radegund in the 1960s while researching Catholic resistance to Nazism, and found almost no one who remembered Jägerstätter clearly or wanted to talk about him. Zahn's subsequent book, In Solitary Witness, brought his story to international attention for the first time. In 2007, Pope Benedict XVI beatified Franz Jägerstätter, the step before sainthood in the Catholic Church, formally recognizing him as a martyr. The Austrian government, which had long denied compensation to families of those executed for desertion, eventually paid recognition to his widow Franziska, who had spent 60 years as a farmer raising her daughters alone. What makes Jägerstätter's story so difficult to sit with is not just his courage, but his isolation. He didn't have a network of resistance fighters around him. He didn't have famous allies or powerful supporters. He had his own conscience, and it told him something that every authority in his life told him was wrong, and he followed it anyway, completely alone, knowing exactly what it would cost him. Henrietta Lacks. In January 1951, a 31-year-old black woman named Henrietta Lacks walked into Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, complaining of vaginal bleeding. She was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cervical cancer. She died 8 months later, on October 4, 1951, leaving behind a husband and 5 children. Without Henrietta Lacks's knowledge or consent, and without her family's knowledge or consent, a sample of her cancer cells had been taken during her treatment and sent to a researcher named George Gay, who had been trying for years to grow human cells in a laboratory. Every previous attempt had failed. Human cells would live for a day or two and then die. Henrietta Lacks's cells did not die. They doubled every 24 hours, surviving and multiplying in ways that no human cells had ever done before. Gay named them HeLa cells, from the first 2 letters of her first and last names, and began sharing them with researchers around the world. Within a year, they were being used to develop the polio vaccine. Within a decade, they had become fundamental to cancer research, virology, genetics, and dozens of other fields. HeLa cells have been used in more than 70,000 scientific studies. They contributed to the development of the polio vaccine, cancer treatments, in vitro fertilization, gene mapping, and research into HIV, Parkinson's disease, and COVID-19. They have been sent into space to study the effects of zero gravity on human cells. They have been grown in such enormous quantities that if you lined up all the HeLa cells ever grown end to end, they would wrap around the Earth 3 times. The pharmaceutical and research industries built around HeLa cells have generated billions of dollars. Henrietta Lacks's family received nothing. For decades, they didn't even know her cells existed. When they found out, through a phone call from a researcher asking for blood samples from her children so they could map the HeLa cell genome, they were confused and frightened. Some family members believed for years that Henrietta herself was still somehow alive in a laboratory somewhere. The ethical dimensions of what happened are profound and still contested. In 1951, there were no legal requirements to obtain informed consent for tissue samples in the way that exists today. Researchers and institutions were not legally required to compensate people for biological material used in research. But the fact that it was legal didn't make it uncontroversial, particularly given the long history of Black Americans being used as research subjects without consent, from the Tuskegee syphilis study to the gynecological experiments performed on enslaved women in the antebellum South. Henrietta Lacks's story remained largely unknown until journalist Rebecca Skloot spent a decade researching it and published The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks in 2010. The book became a bestseller and brought international attention to both Lacks's contribution and her family's treatment. In 2023, a federal judge dismissed a lawsuit brought by her estate against a pharmaceutical company that had used HeLa cells commercially. The legal system, the judge ruled, had not caught up with the ethical questions the case raised. Henrietta Lacks never knew she would change medicine. She never consented to it. She never benefited from it. She died at 31 in a segregated hospital ward, and the cells taken from her body have been keeping other people alive ever since. Paul Rusesabagina. In April 1994, Rwanda descended into one of the fastest and most concentrated genocides in human history. Over approximately 100 days, between 500,000 and 800,000 Tutsi people and moderate Hutus were killed, an average of 8,000 people per day, primarily by Hutu extremist militias called the Interahamwe, using. The international community watched and largely did nothing. The United Nations had peacekeeping forces in Rwanda, but had been ordered not to intervene. France, Belgium, and the United States evacuated their own citizens and withdrew. The UN commander on the ground, Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, had warned of the coming genocide months in advance and been told to stand down. In the capital Kigali, a hotel manager named Paul Rusesabagina was trying to keep people alive. Rusesabagina was the manager of the Hotel de Mille Collines, a luxury hotel owned by a Belgian airline company. He was a Hutu married to a Tutsi woman. When the killing began, Tutsi neighbors and strangers began appearing at the hotel seeking refuge. He let them in. Over the following weeks, Rusesabagina used every tool he had. He called in personal favors from Hutu officials and military commanders he had entertained at the hotel over the years. He used the hotel's supply of food and alcohol as negotiating currency. He made phone calls to Belgian government officials, to the hotel's corporate owners, to anyone he thought might have influence, describing what was happening and pleading for intervention. He told the militias surrounding the hotel that the international community was watching, that prominent people knew about the hotel and its guests, and that harming them would have consequences. He was bluffing largely. The international community was not watching in any meaningful way. At its peak, the hotel sheltered 1,268 people, packed into rooms, hallways, and every available space. Rusesabagina negotiated their safety day by day, sometimes hour by hour, bribing, persuading, and occasionally lying to keep the militias at bay. When UN forces finally evacuated the hotel in late June 1994, all 1,268 people who had sheltered there were alive. His story was told in the 2004 film Hotel Rwanda, in which he was portrayed as a straightforward hero. The reality, like most reality, is more complicated. Rusesabagina was convicted by a Rwandan court in 2021 on terrorism charges related to activities of an opposition group he led in exile, charges that his supporters say were politically motivated and that human rights organizations have described as deeply problematic. Whatever the complexities of his later life, what he did in those 100 days in 1994 is not in dispute. Witold Pilecki. In September 1940, a Polish resistance fighter named Witold Pilecki did something that has almost no parallel in the history of human conflict. He volunteered to be arrested by the Nazis and sent to Auschwitz. Pilecki was a cavalry officer and a member of the Polish underground resistance. Reports had been coming out of the new German concentration camp at Auschwitz, but they were fragmentary and unverified. The Polish resistance needed intelligence. What exactly was happening inside? How many people were there? What were the conditions? Pilecki proposed to find out himself. He walked into a German street roundup in Warsaw in September 1940, a routine Nazi sweep of civilians for forced labor, allowed himself to be captured, and was transported to Auschwitz as prisoner number 4859. He spent 2.5 years inside the camp. During that time, he organized a resistance network within Auschwitz, recruiting fellow prisoners, establishing communication channels, collecting information. He documented the systematic murder that was taking place, the gas chambers, the selections on the arrival ramps, the scale of the killing. He passed reports out of the camp through multiple channels, eventually reaching the Polish government in exile in London and Allied intelligence services. The reports were largely disbelieved. The scale of what Pilecki was describing, the industrial murder of hundreds of thousands of people, was so far beyond anything that had been done before that Allied officials often concluded the accounts must be exaggerated. Some of the reports reached Winston Churchill's desk. The decision was made that Allied resources should remain focused on the military defeat of Germany, rather than any specific operation targeting Auschwitz. In April 1943, Pilecki escaped from Auschwitz, one of the very few people to ever do so voluntarily, having entered voluntarily. He fought in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. After the war, he continued working for Polish intelligence, gathering information about Soviet activities in Poland for the Polish government in exile. In 1947, he was arrested by the communist authorities who now controlled Poland, charged with espionage for the Western powers, and tortured during interrogation. He was executed in May 1948 by a shot to the back of the head. He was 47 years old. For decades under communist rule, Pilecki's name was suppressed in Poland. He was rehabilitated after the fall of communism, and in recent years has received significant recognition, posthumous military promotions, memorial services, documentary films.